Okay, welcome back to the TV Obsessive Podcast. We're here talking about Constellation, episode 6. Paul is dead. We're three-fourths of the way through the season already. This episode, written by Peter Harness, as all the first 5 were, but we've changed directors for the last part of the season. This is directed by Joseph Cedar. Episode 6 sort of switches our perspective and switches our universes and our realities, and is told from the perspective of Paul, who, as we saw in the first episode, was the one who died aboard the ISS. But from the moment that the accident happened, this episode takes us through his reality where he survived, and Joe is the one who died aboard the ISS. In this version of reality, Magnus and Alice are dealing with Joe's death, but their lives back together. It turns out she was left in space by Paul because he remembers receiving an order to do so. Paul is questioned over and over again why he left Joe's body in space, even though he is adamant about the fact that NASA ordered him to do it. His world, much like Joe in the episodes previous to this, starts slipping around. Things don't make sense. His family's names aren't what he remembers. Details about the mission doesn't line up, and his memory starts to go and is not lined up with the world that he is now in. So he seeks someone out who he thinks might be able to help him. He thinks it is Henry Caldera, but in fact it is Bud who exists in this reality. Paul wants to know what's happening to him, but Bud is not interested in talking about anything to do with that. And the episode ends with Bud shooting Paul, going to black, leaving Paul's fate in this reality unclear as we head into the last 2 episodes of the season. Yeah. So pretty straightforward in terms of timeline here and which reality we are in. This even provided some clarity as to, we're pretty clear now that in the universe where Paul died, Joe came over. In the universe where Joe died, Paul came over. So what do we make of this? Just sort of switching our perspectives here this far into the season.
Yeah, well, first of all, I thought it was great.
Yeah.
And I like where the show is going, as implied by doing this, by pulling this move, where it's always a risk when you have an episode of a TV series without the lead.
Yep.
Which is basically what we get here. Mm-hmm. Shifting the perspective to Paul. I like the move. I think it works well. I think you're right that it answers some questions, or definitely gives a good amount of information to help us grapple with those questions. At the same time, there's a lot to parse here.
Yeah,
there's a lot to parse here, and I just want to say, I guess we'll talk through as much of it as we can, and whatever comes up, whatever's interesting. But you can also go read my recap, where I think maybe I just feel like maybe some of these details aren't going to manage to get into our conversation on this one.
And another week of a very good recap from Kevin. This is sort of must reading along with these episodes. I thought very well done again this week.
Thank you. Maybe start with a reality question, right?
Yeah.
Because this is one of the things where, as you said, on the one hand, it almost feels like, oh, okay, we've got to figure it out, right? Like Paul went to the world that Joe was from, and Joe went to the world that Paul was from, but actually no, because it's not. What do we get? There are at least 3 realities that we've seen on screen, not 2, because the starting point for Paul here is the same as the starting point with Joe back in episode 1, I believe. I'm just willing to say that that's the same reality. There's the Cal device. Paul's working on the Cal device, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the biggest wrinkle about the world we proceed in for the most part in this episode, is the Cal device does not exist and never existed in the world that Paul finds himself in.
The Cal device does not exist in the world that we see in this episode. That's what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no familiarity with it by the NASA officials, by Bud Caldera, by anyone he can talk to. Whenever he references that, and you're correct about this, that there's a sense of we have no idea what you're talking about, which is part of that sort of de-evolution of his mind, and sort of things are slipping. He doesn't know what's going on here. Where actually is he?
Right. And I don't think they're covering it up.
Right.
Because this would also seem to be the world we've been seeing all along whenever we've seen Bud. So, I don't know if we quite put this together before, But Henry Caldera is the one who invented the Cal device.
Yeah.
And in the world where he's known as Henry Caldera, where you've seen him and he's, got his act fairly well together. He like won the Nobel Prize and so on and so forth. I think from what we get in this episode, we can put together that in that world, he did save the day on Apollo 18 and so on, right? Whereas in the world where he didn't, he becomes Bud Caldera, who's a failure and a drunk,
Well,
and that has killed at least one person, maybe two at this point.
at least. And so this is an important point to mention is that in those divergent worlds, there's the one where Bud becomes a drunken failure, no one respects him, everyone blames him for what happened. Then there's the Henry Caldera world where he did sort of save the day, as it were, came back, was respected, allowed to continue with his profession, won the Nobel Prize, may understand that things are not right, but it's allowed him to have a career. And then because he had that career, invent this thing that helps him explain what it is that might be going on that made these things happen.
Yeah.
Okay.
What is weird, though, is pulling back from, I think it was last week in episode 5, when Henry Caldera is mentioned when she's at the Skagerrak. Jo says she remembers him being a drunk and a failure. So,
because she came from the world where he was.
but the first Jo that we saw in the series was in a world where the Cal device existed.
All right, you've talked me into a circle here, and I think that you're right about this.
Yeah.
How does the Jo in our quote unquote world know Bud is a drunk and a failure if she's familiar with the Henry who was leading the Cal device before the debris hit it, before the accident, before people died? Yeah, how does she know those unless there's a different reality, some kind of third reality?
Yeah, I'm starting to wonder if there are at least 4. We went down a path that I wasn't fully prepared for.
Yeah,
My mind did as we started talking about this. I think it's unclear, and maybe I already was to that point when I was writing my recap article and all of that. It is because there are at least 3, is what I said, right? Because it seems like there's a shared reality that we start with. There's another wrinkle here that we see in this episode 6. Before Jo dies, there are 2 Joes, very briefly. And we know there are 2 Joes because one of them has lost hold of her iPad and the other one hasn't. They almost seem to see each other,
Yes.
So it does seem like that moment with the Cal device you could point to plausibly as splitting realities, and then weirdness happens and people end up in the wrong worlds or something like that. But look, let me just say this, I guess. I don't know that Constellation is going to ever clear all of this up perspicuously.
Yeah.
And I also don't know that it has to. I think it might be okay if it doesn't.
And so this is maybe this is a question we also save for the end. Sort of this idea of what does Constellation owe those that are watching this show, right? Does it owe all of this explanation, owe all this exposition? And I think you and I would agree that we don't necessarily need that. We prefer a more interesting story and a more interesting narrative than tell us the answer to every question. But there are, with many of these types of shows, certain questions out there that almost seem like they need to answer. What exactly is the Cal doing? Why is it doing it? There are certain things it seems like I was thinking along the lines you were. This episode I thought was great. I was wondering, was it necessary to tell this perspective? And by the end, I landed on yes, it was, to see this other side of it. And so I wonder sort of what's necessary as we finish up this last 25% of the season.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it is, because it's clarifying in terms of thinking about the broad strokes of what's going on. It also seems like Irina is not in this world.
Yeah, exactly.
She's not at the hearing,
Yeah.
right? We can't say definitively she's not in this world, but she's not at the hearing. So
Yeah,
maybe this is also
she
the world.
led the hearing in Joe's world.
Yep,
She's nowhere to be seen in the one with Paul.
correct. Yeah, yeah. So,
So is that the world where it has to be the world where she died as a cosmonaut if we're connecting those dots?
that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
And really does seem to be a big way. There's a strong temptation to reduce everything into two,
Hmm.
right? You've got the world where Paul lived, Joe died, Irina's dead, Bud is a failure, the Cal device does not exist,
Hmm.
and Alice speaks Swedish.
Yep.
You've got the other world where Paul died, Joe lives, Irina's alive, Henry's a success, and Alice does not speak Swedish. And there is
Right.
a Cal device, if I didn't hit on it. It seems like, like those are the main two.
Hmm.
And I can't quite formulate this yet, but I'm going to try. I have this percolating interpretation that there are actually a whole bunch more, and that the versions are just kind of so close together
Hmm.
that for the sake of the story, it doesn't quite matter that there are a manifold or
Right.
something like this, as opposed to two or three. Um, and maybe that's why the show's called Constellation.
Oh, okay. So Constellation is a series, sometimes a large series of things. You connect the dots and it all makes up one picture, right?
That's what I'm working on.
Yeah. We actually haven't referenced or talked about any constellations in
Right?
this
Why
show.
is the show called Constellation?
Yeah, this is a good idea you stumbled on here, I think. Yeah, so the one complete story can't be told without this multiple points from which to connect all of them.
Yeah. So we'll see how it plays out. You know,
Yeah.
um, I know the name of next week's episode. I think we can probably say it. Did you notice the name of next week's episode?
No, but I'm going to go look while you're while you're saying about this. Oh, okay. Okay, yes, I did know this. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
We've
I mean,
referenced this before. Yeah.
but no, here's the thing. When we talked about Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass before, I had not noticed that yet.
Yeah. Yeah. Same.
Um, but okay, so there's every chance next week's going to focus on Alice. Um,
Which,
particularly,
which I must say, it needs to. We need
yep.
to. That's one of the maybe the top question of what we need to focus on before this series out is what exactly is happening to Alice? Why is it happening to Alice? And how can again, we apparently saw at the end of this episode as well, how can Alice be in the same place twice? Of the fact that we know that this is twins playing them.
Well, yeah, but the fact that she sees Joe, we
Yes.
get several things in this episode. Um, this is an Alice who speaks Swedish. They have the memorial service, and we
Yes.
see that from the other way around. She's to see herself
Hmm.
and freak out. And then at the end of the episode, th this whole thing where she goes to the cabin with Magnus seems to line up with what we saw previously at the beginning of episode 4. Carrying that forward, she's looking out the window and she sees Joe arriving to the cabin, presumably with the other Alice in the back seat, right?
Exactly.
So it's
Yep.
taking us to that moment of these things kind of coming together that we've been hitting on throughout the series.
Yeah. Which again raises another series of questions of is the Cal creating some sort of liminal space? Is the cabin a liminal space? Is there something happening between one of the people that has created this sort of liminal space where these can actually exist at the same time, although they are clearly in different realities or universes? I mean, that was quite the scene to leave that episode on. I can only imagine that we're going to get something about Alice, her perspective, and what's actually happening to her, leading back up to that again in episode 7.
Yeah. And one wrinkle I want to be sure to note here is that as much as signs point to the Cal device, the one version of Irina died in the 60s. Apollo 18 was back in the late 60s,
Right.
right? Now we're playing with quantum mechanics, and so okay.
Yep.
You could have an event in the future affect the past. I think that's an open possibility. Maybe they'll go in that direction. Um, but I think they are more in the wheelhouse of the kind of many worlds interpretation.
Yeah.
And the question is just whether the Cal device is opening up to the communication between those worlds,
Yeah.
maybe, more than anything.
I put this in there. There's this theory floating around. See what you thought about this. That they showed it again in this episode. That the Cal accident happens while Joe is on her iPad FaceTiming with Alice, and she is showing Alice the experiment when things go haywire. And
Yeah.
so, in addition to Joe and Paul, who have had all of these things happen, Alice actually observed it. We know that Henry observed it when he got it back to Earth. He couldn't replicate it. He couldn't show anyone, but he observed it, right? So these things are happening to people who literally observed this experiment happening with the cow. Is that possible, even though Alice was, watching it on FaceTime?
I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's just something I wonder in the back of my mind is a lot of things point to the Cal as central to this, but um is it the full answer?
Yeah.
Um if it's presented as such, then I guess yeah, you could say, well, Alice was on the FaceTime with her mother when they were looking at it and so on. I don't know about Irina, I mean it's
Yeah. And the cow didn't exist with Irina and Henry Budd all those decades ago.
yeah, that was my point, right?
Yeah.
And recall also Henry's whiteboard. He's got death in space on there. So how does
Yeah.
death in space factor in?
Mhm.
Um, in terms of your previous question, I do feel like the show owes us some level of a explanation related to that, or at
Yeah.
least enough to allow for coherent interpretation. It
Yeah.
doesn't have to spoon feed us, but needs to at least give us enough to work with to kind of like have a line on it. This is how I
Yeah.
interpret it, and it holds up.
I agree. I agree with that.
Um, Brief step back where this would have fit in. We're talking about Alice in the Cabin. Maybe worth noting because we talked about the paintings on here. They call attention to it. How did this land for you? Because I thought that the way they talked about the paintings was actually kind of weird.
Yeah, it was trying to, again, this is just one of those things I think this is better left open to our interpretation and trying to
Yeah.
explain. Not they weren't trying to explain, but they're trying to, through Alice, say what each character thought about the paintings, what certain characters thought about the paintings. What wasn't my favorite way to come back and revisit that idea of what these paintings could be about.
Yeah. I wasn't particularly since I took the time to like write a whole article. They're like, they called attention to it. They're like, okay, but I mean, it was interesting that they were referring to the painting on the wall as
Mhm.
paintings,
Yep.
them. Magnus goes along with that. Alice calls the painting a changeling,
Yeah.
which so maybe she sees different versions of the painting at different times. I tried to do some research on this. To my knowledge, there are no paintings that like change like that. That's not a thing. I mean, if instead of a painting it was a big tablet on the wall, sure,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I don't think in terms of something that's actually a painting.
And it does, I think, force us to revisit the question of are these Alice's like, I don't know what the right verbiage is here, interchanging between places. So I mean she's going to the same place and she's seeing these paintings change, and that's the only explanation she could have for it. Is it something that just changes while it's up on the wall?
Yeah. I mean, I think we've got to be going in something like this direction. This
Yeah.
episode ends. Alice is looking out the window. She sees Joe out there. What does she do next? Puts on her coat, trucks outside of the cabin, doesn't see Joe. Thus, it would connect up to seeing her in the snow, yelling "Mama," and so on
Mhm.
and so forth. What she does that for a while, gives up, goes back to the cabin. Oops, it's not the same cabin anymore. Now it's the frozen cabin, and no one is there. And she hides in the cupboard. and then Joe comes along and finds her from the other universe. And this is how I'm fitting things together in my mind already. And like,
Yeah.
I haven't watched the next episode yet, so if that is directly what happens,
Yeah.
apologies, but I haven't watched it yet. So,
Yeah.
um,
That's just as a quick aside here. That's important to know for anybody listening to this. You and I make a point to not watch ahead. So all of our thoughts, theories, and anticipations are based in just what we know week to week. We do not watch ahead.
yeah, particularly with a show like this, I don't want to,
Yeah.
do it. Another big question is the situation between Bud and Henry
Mhm.
meaningfully the same or different from that of Joe, Paul, and Irina? I'm lumping them all together. Why? Because we know that there's a version of Joe who died in space, a version of Paul who died in space, a version of Irina who died in space. Is there a version of Henry who died in space? I'm not sure that we know that.
I'm not sure that we know that. We know there is a version of Henry who was able to rescue his fellow astronauts and save Apollo 18 in some way. There's a version who was not able to do that. But yeah, that's wildly different than those who have died and therefore have switched realities, switched universes. So that, again, that would go back to why is Henry's on his whiteboard death in space when he apparently, as far as we know, did not experience that. Maybe there is a version of him somewhere who did.
You're right. Like that's one possibility is that no, there is a third version of Henry who died in space.
Mhm.
And the implication potentially would be there's a third version of Joe, there's a third version of Paul, there's a third version of Irina. I was about to say that we haven't seen, but maybe we have seen them and we just haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah, I think that you know it's hard to say what would be satisfying here, but for them to somehow connect us to how are we seeing each, if there were three or more, how are we seeing each of those universes along the way, or each of those realities along the way? Because yeah, as Henry is contemplating this idea of death in space and what that means for whatever's happening to these people, he, as far as we know, did not experience that. But if he's going on that philosophy, he must know something or have experienced something or understand that there may be a version of me out there who did die.
Maybe that's why it's on the board because he doesn't
Yeah,
know, and he's
exactly.
like,
He has to know.
maybe one possibility is there's a version of me who died in space. Is
Yeah,
that
in space? Question mark.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Lithium sevens circled for some reason. Yeah. Bud is angry. There's also questions about how his timeline fits together. He apparently shoots Paul at the end of the episode. We don't see Paul having been shot. Um, uh, it felt to me like this was before when he makes Henry piss his pants, but I'm really not sure.
I have to go back and look at what the timeline is there.
It's the only thing is Bud seems so resistant to. He tells Paul to take his pills and so on and so forth.
Yeah. I wonder if I was trying to think what the timeline was because he goes to see Bud right after the funeral service for Joe, as far as I understand it, or pretty soon thereafter, of the same day or what.
We don't really know how long it's been. It could be a week
Yeah.
or two.
Yeah, we don't know.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
And I'm curious to see what they do with that because, as far as we know, we have not seen one of our other characters die in the universe that they are not supposed to be in. Does something happen there? Does something revert? Whatever you're thinking. What happens? Does that sort of throw things out of sync here? If someone dies where they're not supposed to, I'm curious to see what they.
Yeah, that's an interesting possibility. Yeah. I'm just thinking that something like Bud kind of sort of seems to think like NASA maybe sent Paul to him and now he's angry and then that would motivate his anger towards Henry more than we'd seen before. But kind of unclear
That's also a thread they have to follow is just how capable is Bud and being able to go F up Henry's world, as he said he was going to in episode 5, right? What does he mean by that? What is he going to do? How is he able to do it? That will be a thread I think that they need to follow as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure they will. So the title of the episode is "Paul is Dead."
Mm.
I think it's a Beatles reference.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I mean, I had not until you sort of showed us these notes. I had not put that together.
This would be the Paul is
Thoughts
Dead
on
myth.
that? Yeah. No, just want to do your general thoughts on that, and if that could mean anything more right after we come off of the show where a Beatles song was playing nonstop, and there was a reference to that, and true.
Right,
I
it's
don't know
true.
if there's a deeper thing here, but
Well, I mean, if anyone listening is unaware, right, this would be a reference to what's known as the Paul is Dead myth. You could look it up, you could read about it in more detail. But yeah, this period of time in the 1960s where there's like a conspiracy theory that Paul McCartney had actually died and was replaced by a doppelganger, as it were. And Paul McCartney finally comes out and says, rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated.
yeah,
Which I think is actually a Mark Twain quote originally. But anyway, there's this whole conspiracy that Paul McCartney was dead, but then he comes back, he comes out and says, I'm not dead. And then of course the world being what it is, some people continue to believe that was still a fake Paul McCartney, and I just thought it was interesting to put in there with this character, Paul, and what's going on in this show. I don't know if there's anything more to read into it than
yeah.
thematic resonance and it being kind of a cool, just cultural connection. But
Yeah, that's sort of this. It does resonate in the fact that this is clearly dealing with themes of what is reality, what's your observed reality versus the actual reality. What do you believe in the face of facts that are staring you in the face, whether you choose to believe them or not, right? So it's sort of what do you make of the reality that you're in? I mean, I certainly see a theme of that throughout this, that you're fighting against something that is right, that is the way things have to be, but clearly where you are, that's not the case.
yeah, so how does this? We're thinking about conspiracy. You just put me in mind. I think one of the taglines for the show is something like "Reality is a conspiracy," which I don't pay much attention to that. Do you think that there is like a bigger? Is there a conspiracy in the background? Are there nefarious forces behind all of this? Do you think, or is it you know quantum weirdness caused by death in space, sort of thing?
Yeah, the more I think about it, because I thought, well, there must be in a universe where we have Henry, we have Irina, we have the lithium pills, we have astronauts who take either A or B pills, and they're forced to do this to sort of ground themselves and not experience this high altitude psychosis that they're claiming everyone has. There's got to be something, we're going to find more and more layers to that every time we dig into this. Yeah, maybe we will, but also just wonder if it's just a matter of Irina and Henry, something happened to them in decades past, and so they've been working to figure out what that is ever since, and they have stumbled on something, just sort of this trope of the box that humans never should have opened, right? The things that we never should have explored, the closets we should have never looked in, type of thing. So I don't know how deep something like that goes.
Yeah.
Or this idea of we were never meant to go down that road.
I mean, you did put me in mind just now of the scene. I don't remember what episode it was, maybe episode 3, where Henry and Irina are dancing, and then all of a sudden she's dead. He sees her
Yeah.
as dead.
Yep.
I don't know why I felt like noting that right now, but she's definitely involved in this. She's not in this episode.
No.
Um, Michaela seems to have a more prominent position in this episode
Mhm.
than in the other reality, as it were. Yeah, she mentions high altitude psychosis, which apparently, like, is a thing, maybe, I guess. Like there
Yeah.
are indications of that kind of phenomenon people struggling with.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess I don't know. I'm sort of leaning in the direction of thinking that the ultimate answer is more metaphysical or something. But maybe not.
Yeah. I think that's probably right in that we've got so many metaphysical and quantum questions to answer over the next couple of episodes that that's where they will spend their time doing that. We will clearly be focusing on Alice in episode 7, and then seeing how these strands tie together in 8.
Yeah. And thinking back to the tagline, reality is a conspiracy, I suppose, does not necessarily mean that there are dark forces in a smoke-filled room, but could simply be hitting on the idea that reality is what everyone agrees is reality. So
Yeah.
if you're Paul and you find yourself in this world where everyone else agrees about what reality is, it's like Bud says to him, that's not what happened. It's what I thought happened, but it's not what happened. Because look, all of the evidence and everyone in the world knows that Apollo 18 was a disaster and so on. At a certain point, I have to say, well, I must be remembering incorrectly.
Yeah.
Um, but I do
At
think,
what point do you stop thinking everyone else is wrong and that you're just crazy? What makes you get to that point? I think is a fascinating theme here.
and if Bud now is breaking the other way after years and years and years, he's breaking the other way and saying, "No, you know what? Actually,
Yeah.
um, what I remember is what happened and so on."
Yeah.
um it does resemble like a psychotic break. It should we be on Bud's side? I'm not entirely sure, right?
I don't know.
He's a murderer.
He,
And
he is
you
a
know
multiple time murderer, but who's to say that these things don't force you into those type of actions if you've gone through them? I mean, I think we really just can't say at this point.
yeah, so looking forward to the two more episodes of
Yep.
Constellation to wrap up this story. Or we don't know for sure,
Yep.
if they have plans and intentions for further seasons or how much closure we'll get. But I think we've hit on everything in our notes. I
Yep.
really enjoyed talking through this with you, Ryan.
Yeah, this is a great one to really spend some mental and verbal energy on. And like I said, the recaps have been great on the site. These have been good conversations trying to think through what's happening here. I think that we'll get to the end of 8 and have even more questions, and that's fine. We're happy to leave it that way sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, this type of show might not be for everyone.
That's
As
right.
you were referencing earlier, like, do you want to put on a TV show while you're folding laundry or,
Yeah.
you probably want something else. You got to pay attention and think on this one. But I love it in that regard. And the fact that I'm doing things like finishing the episode and going back to rewatch scenes from previous episodes,
Yep.
right up my alley. So,
Yeah,
all
looking forward to
right.
seeing.
All right, so I think that does it. Thanks for listening. As per usual, check out tvobsessive.com. Find my recaps of Constellation on there and all kinds of other stuff about TV. Follow the site on social media. Search for TV Obsessive. This will be available wherever you can find your podcast. Maybe that's how you're listening to it. Actually listening on our YouTube channel. If so, please do like and subscribe and all of that sort of thing. And we'll see you next week.
All right, till next time.